Welcome back to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. The topic that we're covering in this series is critical thinking skills applied to science. And this chapter is on culture and how culture has an influence in the way we even think. We're using a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. I'm using a quote from Stephen Jay Gould that kind of set me on a certain path of understanding how culture influences all of our thinking, all of our life. That happened because we had the opportunity, my wife and I and family, to live for 25 years cross-culturally as educators. And I'm the one that came away educated because I went down with a Western frame of education, and well, for the first experience, it went fine. It went all right. It was in a private university. But then I had an opportunity to go over to a public university, and that's when I hit a stone wall. It was completely different. I wasn't communicating well. I wasn't teaching. The students weren't learning. There was just a real difference. Even though it was the same country and in the same city, one was a private university and the other one was a public. And my curiosity, I used that experience as the basis for my research project of researching how culture influences educational models, how culture influences thinking processes, and how I have to change according to the cultural tendency of my students. And why at the private university, why was it not so different? The private university, I believe, was not so different from my experience previous, because at a private university, students have to pay to be there, and so they had good jobs, or their families had good jobs. Most of them had been exposed to Western education, and most of them had access to books and good quality teaching. So I think that was a major difference, whereas at the public university, a lot of them were rural students that were coming in from the countryside that had no real resources that they had been taught with previously. There weren't books for everybody, and so it was a lot of rote memory. So it's just it was a different experience, but that's what set me onto exploring how culture influences thinking processes. And that's when I came across this quote by Stephen Jay Gould that has been kind of the basis for my thinking, my sorting things out. We got the pair of glasses here, and the glasses are looking at the world, and it's kind of like we're looking at the same world, but we're coming up with different interpretations of that world. And Stephen Jay Gould, he said, "First, facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them." Stephen Jay Gould. So this series we're looking at, in this chapter, we're looking at culture and how culture influences what we look at. And that's the slide here is theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. So what we're going to do is, in my experience as educator, as teacher, professor at the State University, I did observations of what was the difference between my disposition as a teacher and the dispositions of my students that came in. Were we of the same disposition? Were we of the same mindset to be able to communicate and be able to educate one and the other? Well, what we're going to go over is the different thoughts, different beliefs between my culture being more Western and the culture of my students. And I came up with about 17 differences, and in this series we're just going to go over specific differences that affect the cognitive thinking mode. So we're not going over music or food or or whatever frame, what we're going over is cognitive. What were the differences in our thinking patterns? The first difference that I noted was the universal domains, in that as Westerners, I divide, been taught to divide, the world into the natural and supernatural dimensions. And that, for some, is totally separate. And that's why there's bars in between them. The Western tendency is to believe that there is a natural world and that there may be a supernatural world, but they're separate. They don't interfere. And that's what our modern day science is built off of, is that there may exist a supernatural, but that supernatural does not intervene or does not affect the cause and effect process. And so that's in modern day science, which is built on that assumption of what's called methodological naturalism, is that we have to assume that everything is natural and we explain everything through natural causes. The non-Western tendency doesn't divide the world into natural and supernatural. Most of them live in a world that is occupied by the creator spirits, or the creator spirit, and that which was created. And so there's no division. That's why the two colons is that it's permeable. There's access from one to the other, and that you can't divide, you can't separate one into two different domains. They're not separable. Is that the spirit world, in fact, for a lot of non-Westerners, the spirit world dominates over the physical world. And so it's a whole different mindset to come in and ask them, okay, we're going to do science now, and I want you to separate your beliefs from, the natural world. And it'd be kind of like, well, how do you do that? You can't do that. And so it's kind of like, okay, this was one of my first learning points. Universal domains. What do you count as universal domain? Do you count or divide into natural and supernatural, and that you can separate them off? Or are you more non-Western that says, no, that the spirit world permeates my everyday life? And so that is a big difference. That is a major difference. Number two, getting back to the same idea of the supernatural, the natural and supernatural, is the division between matter and spirit. And your first one kind of determines it, but this gets more specific. The Western tendency, again, is to separate matter from spirit, and to say that some would be materialists to the point of saying that there's only matter, that there is no spirit. And there's others that would say, no, there is matter and there is spirit, but they are separate. And so that's in the Western thinking. Western thinking tends to put things in boxes, into categories, and that's Western philosophy, is to put things into clean, separate boxes so that we can identify them. And that's what we do as Western tendency with matter and spirit. We put them in two different boxes. Now, maybe those two boxes can overlap sometimes, maybe they don't. But in a non-Western tendency, you can't separate spirit from matter. They are one unified domain, and when you're addressing one, you're addressing the other. And again, predominance is the spirit. And that's where, in a non-Western culture, they're very respectful of that spirit dimension, of that spirit world, and of not offending whatever spirit that might be governing in their belief system over certain areas. For example, in our area where we worked, there was, out in the rural area, you would ask permission from the spirit over hunting, or the spirit over the forest, or the spirit over the waters, for success. And that, or even farming and plowing and sowing, they would ask and recognize the spirit world in that dimension within that process. Whereas in the Western world, everything is reduced down to a science, and a science that is by the numbers and that does not allow the spirit within. That's number 2, matter and spirit. Number 3 is the universal operating system. How does your world operate? How does my world operate? Well, the Western tendency is to view the world as a closed system. In other words, we might believe in miracles, but we rarely expect one. Maybe we do believe there can be, or we might believe there even can't be miracles because we are in a closed system. And if we are going with modern day science rules, ground rules, then no, it's a closed system and always closed. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit later in the different models of science, in that there's about 7 models of science, in which we're going to look over models of origins, but there's only one model that keeps a continually closed system. And all the other models admit an intervention at least once, or maybe twice, or maybe continual. And so that is really the separation. But as a scientific model, if you allow one intervention, then you've transgressed the rule of modern day science, which does not allow any interventions. So they would all be called pseudosciences. Whatever model advocates a designer, advocates a creator, advocates whatever influence that is from outside the system, would be disqualified as a pseudo-scientific model. The non-Western tendency is an open system. Everything is a miracle, and everything is influenced by the spirit world. So whatever they do, whatever their actions are, it's always in respect to those governing powers, which are external to them. So it's governed by the Creator, spirits, miracles, and it's a world that is not predictable, because we can't control, or they can't control, the spirits. So how can you predict what is going to happen? Whereas in the Western world, everything is closed system. It governed by natural laws, and so it is predictable. This is number 3. We're going to go over several more, but this is coming to the end of the first video, the first section on it. We're Tim and Holly. If you want to get in touch with us, you can through the email listed here, or we have a internet site at cultureworldvieworigins.net. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you in the next video.